high-speed technical package. And this was released by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention a few years ago. And it's a really valuable tool that a lot of RPE strategies are based, draw on these strategies and forward. I had the opportunity of helping give input into the development of this tool. And I think it's a really great opportunity to really talk about some of the key strategies. And they talk about promoting social norms that protect against sexual violence, teaching skills to prevent sexual violence. The ones in particular for RPE that, so the social norms, I think, is an important part of RPE. Also providing opportunities to empower girls and women is an important part of RPE, and along with create protective environments. The last one they list is support victims and survivors to lessen harms. That's not part of RPE, but is such an important part of the work that we do at rape crisis centers in California. So I think it's a really useful tool, and be able to do that. We should probably actually put a link in to where to get that. You also can get it in the hub. So I'll do that. I'll put the link to it in the thing in just a moment.
There are a couple other really important foundational documents to your program. And so you can think of these as like your field guides or your holy books or whatever seems more important to you. And so one of them, you may be surprised to know, is the request for application. This was the original request for folks to apply for funding, and it gives really the outline of what's important to RPE and what's required for implementing RPE in California, according to CDPH and to the Centers for Disease Control, where the funding originates, which we'll talk about later. But this really gives you background and guideline on what's expected for programs in California. And then the other three are your program's application that they wrote. Sarah's gonna put a quick poll up, and I'd like to know, because anybody who started in the last year would not have had input on their program's application. I'd like to know how many of you have seen your organization's original application for your program? So it looks like a good amount of people have, almost 50%. So 50-50 no, and I'm not sure, and 50% yes. So this is not surprising. And I would suggest that you go back and ask to see that, because it lays out a lot of the thinking around what the folks before you, the folks at your organization had when they were coming up with this project design. So if sometimes you find yourself out there going, why am I doing this? You can look back in the RFA and in your organization's application to see, what the thinking was at the time and what the original plan was. The other pieces that are really important, I wonder how many of you, I'm not sure, will be like, oh, I've seen this, yeah. So I have, oh, sorry, David, I'm answering your private question. Yes, I have chimes behind me. It's too late, I have to answer it now. So hopefully it's not too distracting. So you'll want to go back and look at that application. You don't have to, keep it next to you, but make sure you know what's in there. And then the other two pieces are your logic model. The logic model is part of the RFA, and it gives a snapshot of the project activities and then what we hope will change because of those project activities. And we'll talk about logic models later, as well as your work plan, which is kind of your roadmap. How are you gonna get all those activities done to reach those outcomes? So think of those 4 things as things that you should have read and have handy when you have kind of questions about your program going through. So the RFA your organization's application, the logic model, and the work plan.
So we are going to briefly cover prevention perspectives and frameworks. In short, the frameworks that we're going to look at are different frameworks or different lenses that we have that we view prevention work through. So prevention work is broad. It can look a lot of different ways. Of course, this is a lot of what we'll be discussing today. And there's different ways that we can look at it through. So we're going to go over a few of the frameworks, what we most often see, and while there could probably be entire trainings on each of these different frameworks, we're going to go through them pretty quickly just to get some working definitions about what they mean, and that'll sort of inform our different approaches to the work, and we'll be having a bit of a discussion about that as well. So we have the criminal legal framework. This is also often called the criminal justice framework. This perspective views issues of sexual assault and domestic violence primarily as criminal activities and as violations of public safety. So this framework often views sexual assault and intimate partner violence as crimes against the state rather than harm caused to the individual. We have the social justice framework. The social justice framework views sexual assault and domestic violence as acts of oppression and considers the roots of violence and oppression as well, including a manifestation of systemic power imbalances. So you can see in this image here, we have what we call the issue tree, and we'll be looking at one of these a little bit more in depth later. But I think that this really is a good kind of encapsulation of the social justice approach to sexual assault and domestic violence, kind of a good visual of how we see that historical events and beliefs and institutions and community and social norms, which prevention works really hard to address, really just contributes to these issues, and that sexual violence and interpersonal violence, for example, aren't just singular issues, but are in fact a symptom or a result of internalized oppression. So the goal of prevention through this lens is not just to end violence, but also to end all forms and practices of oppression, knowing that of which violence is a result. Feminist organizing, this is the framework largely on which the movement was built. The feminist-based perspective views sexual assault and domestic violence through a gender-based analysis. So coming from inequalities experienced by different genders, and of the conditions that exist and result in violence against women and femmes and women identified folks particularly. This framework places the work of prevention within the work to improve the conditions of historically women and now more marginalized genders. Reproductive justice framework, also something that we see coming up quite a bit. The reproductive justice framework views sexual assault and domestic violence as barriers in a person's effort to really obtain full rights and resources necessary to make healthy and informed decisions about their body, obviously including sexuality and reproduction, which is very interlinked with sexual violence. Very simply, the human rights perspective views sexual assault and domestic violence as violations of the fundamental rights of all people. So human rights perspective acknowledges that humans are born having these fundamental rights, not just privileges, and to be free from interpersonal violence and sexual violence is a basic human right. So we'll be approaching prevention through that perspective, through the human rights framework. And lastly, we have the public health model. This is largely what we'll be talking about today. RPE grantees particularly work from a public health model. That's what RPE was sort of based on or born out of social justice as well. But we'll be talking a lot about the intricacies of the public health model and what that looks like through RPE. In short, this perspective views sexual assault and domestic violence through a public health lens, which is informed by an understanding of kind of the broader health and safety impact of sexual assault and domestic violence. Sexual assault and domestic violence was originally born out of, like I said, feminist organizing and social justice, and was not within the realm or the framework of public health and its funding. So this is a relatively new thing. When we talk about this, I think, and we'll talk about it more later, but we would be remiss not to mention that public health and health history in the U.S. Has a pretty sordid past in using health research in pretty oppressive ways, and so that's something that has had an impact on marginalized communities who experience sexual violence. And we'll be looking more at some of this later on, but it's something that we like to mention when we talk about public health and the history of all of these frameworks and how the movement was built. So we are going to send folks to breakout rooms, which I'm going to do just in a moment. We're going to have, I think, 3 folks per room, and we'll be discussing, or in your groups, y'all will be discussing which of these frameworks connect with your approach, your personal approach to prevention work. So I am going to put the frameworks in the chat and with the question as well, and send everyone into breakout rooms. Sorry, bear with me as I only have 2 hands to type. Okay, so everyone should be able to see that in the chat. Go ahead and make a quick note if you need to. We will be organizing folks into their breakout rooms. So give me just a minute and that should send you away. I wonder if I need to stop sharing my screen to do this because I'm clicking it and nothing's happening. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Thanks for your patience, everyone. All right, and we will have about 5 minutes. Okay, you should be getting sent to your breakout rooms. Hello, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to do a quick share out in just a moment. Let me put our slides back up here. All right, everyone see our slides back up? Can I get a thumbs up from a couple folks if you can see it? Okay, perfect. Okay, we'll just do a quick 2 to 3 minute debrief. Feel free to share in the chat. If you would like to unmute yourself and share with your voice, that would also be great. Feel free to use the hand raising function. Did anything come up for folks? Let us know which of these frameworks connect to your personal approach to prevention work. What'd you talk about?
Hey, Sarah, this is Kelson from RTS.
Kelson.
I was in a room with David and Anna, and actually it was cool to talk about, David shared that in the early works of RTS, he worked with Sarah Jarvis, and it was kind of, the curriculum was kind of geared around feminist reproductive rights. And I can definitely see that in our curriculum and in old notes that we kind of look through every year, and how that kind of has changed and navigated through what it is now. It's kind of cool to hear from David where it was and where it is now, and I see those influences through previous programs and grants and RFAs throughout the history of RTS. So that was cool to hear.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Kelson. David, do you want to share with the whole class briefly?
Well, I was just talking about, some work that I had done a long time ago, actually, with Sarah at RTS about looking at we brought together people who did sexual violence prevention, domestic violence prevention, and reproductive rights organizers. And we convened to be able to find ways to find the common grounds of how we would do that, do the work, because we saw such common messaging. And so it was really helpful to move forward. So I think that was interesting to see, because I love the comment that it was someone was saying, Samantha was talking about how we can connect these, how in some ways it's about picking the pieces that make sense and then recognizing there's some that are problematic, but there's some that are really powerful that can move forward.
Yeah, and I also like a comment in the chat from Kevin that says it's hard to pick one framework as they all intersect in different ways. And some mentioned that their agencies adapt frameworks based on their community needs. So I appreciate that observation too. Anybody else want to share parts of their conversation or share your personal framework that informs your approach to prevention? See some other comments in the chat agreeing that human rights is the basis for prevention or the foundation, and that kind of expands out to social justice. Absolutely. We talked about how students are curious on social justice issues with our climate. So using this lens as a foundation helps with giving the students tools to be able to have that critical thinking foundation. Yes, absolutely. Swimmy says that we discussed the intersectionality of all the frameworks, but discussed the criminal justice and public health more specifically, especially since our organizations work closely with law enforcement. Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting consideration as well, right? We have our personal frameworks perhaps, and then our agencies might have their own mission or their own framework, dependent on other things, and sometimes those things align and sometimes they don't. So I think one of the challenges can be in identifying our own personal framework or kind of our why and how we think things need to be approached doesn't always align with organizations or even funders or the movement in kind of a larger context. Yeah, and then David says sometimes our funder has its own framework too. Absolutely. Any last comments or questions, of course, about the frameworks? Anyone a little bit confused on the frameworks or why we're talking about frameworks at all? David, Jesse, do you have anything to add before we move on to our next section? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. We are going to transition a bit now, and I'm going to hand it over to Jesse.
Now, of course, I took down the wind chimes, but there is some other construction happening outside my house. So hopefully that will work. I am currently tasked with giving the shortest history of RPE in California ever. So the RPE program in California, the funding really originates at the Centers for Disease Control. So when you feel like you're the only one in the world that does this job and talks about rape all the time, and students call you things like, oh, that rape lady's coming today, you are not alone. So not only do you have your colleagues here in the state that, you know, you get to see now virtually, but hopefully we'll get to be with in person again someday. There are folks, you know, all over the country doing RPE work. And so the principles of RPE are really these check boxes. We want to prevent first-time perpetration and victimization. So when we start talking about, we'll talk about risk factors, we'll talk about what primary prevention is, that's what it means to prevent first-time perpetration. And this is really, you know, wanting to use data to inform our work, wanting to collect data to measure our impact, and to create social change and change social norms. Yeah, I know. So in California, this has been an evolving program. The RPE program has really been around for decades in California. It was previously combined with our RCC grants. Let's see if I can talk and walk to get away from this noise. Yeah. So this program has evolved, and it really started out, I'll take you a tour through my kitchen. It really started out as really raising, oh, it's louder outside. Okay. As really raising awareness in the community. So we did a lot of, you know, sexual assault 101 classes, self-defense, and then later, around 2005, we really started to make a shift when the California Department of Public Health began to administer the programs. And that's where those of us who were in program then, which some of the folks on the call were actually, we started to really shift toward the public health model, which looked at comprehensive programming, which looked at multiple dose education and skills building, and really doing what we call saturation instead of sprinkling. So, you know, looking at like a comprehensive school-based programs came out of this change, and it happened slowly over several years. And if you've been in here for a while, you see that we are continuing on that path to really look at how we approach at a population level and a community level. So the program has evolved over many years. There are currently 24 funded programs in California. And for this funding cycle of 4 years. And then, oh, I guess I can't change the slide, Sarah. Can go forward. So you can see this little map here, and you can see, oh, there's Suemi and Edwin there on the call, and folks from Peace Over Violence. So you can see a little flow chart here. We're funded by Centers for Disease Control, administered by California Department of Public Health. You can see here all your organizations represented in this orange box, and us providing training and technical assistance from CalCASA. And then the way the programs break down, which is new for this funding cycle, is that we have 2 tiers worth of programs. And so the first tier is community mobilization. So you all will recognize that, some of you will recognize that as the close to home programs that are operating in communities. You can go to the next slide. And tier 2 are the comprehensive school-based programs. So does everyone recognize themselves in one of those tiers? I hope so. And so each of the tiers has essential elements. So this is really what is required. What makes RPE in California RPE? What makes you a tier 2 or tier 1 program is really these essential elements. And this brings us to being able to have the comprehensive programs, which we'll also talk about later, to really make change in local communities where RPE programs are. So you can see specificity in those essential elements for community mobilization, including the 4 phases of the close to home approach, including youth and adult organizing. And in comprehensive school-based programs, highlighted things are youth leadership teams who contribute to developing school-wide activities and looking at sexual violence prevention policy. So these get us toward, you know, the more community level change that makes some larger impacts for more people. So I'm going to turn it to David to talk about prevention more specifically.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Jesse. And can you mute your phone? There. Oh, I'm getting a little feedback. There, now the feedback disappeared. Technology is great, and you get to hear all the ambient sounds. So I actually came to CalCASA in 2005 as we saw CDPH taking the lead on the RPE program, and I had a background in public health, having done prevention and with the public health piece from the past. So it was really exciting to be there. And so I want to share some of these concepts that we have of prevention. So we'll go to the next slide. This sort of in 2005 was the big discussion we were having, is we wanted to really point out that prevention was not awareness. And that a lot of our work we were doing up to then was really just building awareness of what sexual violence it was, and as opposed to being prevention. So what's the difference between prevention and awareness? So I just want to think about how awareness was about sort of raising what sexual violence was, what some of the dynamics were, often giving somebody, letting people know, you know, how often it happened, giving people definitions. And sometimes it was awareness of what resources were available. Letting people know that rape crisis centers existed was an important piece. Whereas prevention was actually working to try to prevent it from happening again, sexual violence from happening again, or from happening in the first place. And that prevention was about changing the conditions in which sexual violence would happen. So then we have a move to the next slide. So we sort of, and so public health gave a vocabulary of 3 different types of prevention, and primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. And so tertiary prevention is sort of responding, or tertiary, it's responding. So it's after violence has taken place, of what we can be able to prevent the reoccurrence of that violence. So it would be working with those who, it could be involved with working those who have been abused, to talk, so they would not be in their healing, or so they won't be abused again, or it would be for those who have abused to make sure that they did not abuse people further. So that was a tertiary. Secondary prevention, or an early intervention, was identifying those who were at most risk, or had, you know, experienced things that would be putting people at risk for that situation, and that we would be doing something to be able to address those people. And primary prevention was trying to be able to do something that would prevent it from happening in the first place. And RPE's focus was on primary prevention. Though we, as rape crisis centers, do work on all of these levels of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, that we know that RPE put its focus on the primary prevention. And to me, primary prevention was so important because that's the hope that we can actually have the biggest impact overall, but it's also in some ways the hardest to do, but it's a way that we can be able to move forward. Let's go to the next slide. Making sure I got my, oh, I'm gonna hand it over back to Sarah to do a little quiz.
Sort of, yeah, we'll tag team it a bit. I will launch the polling. We're gonna do a quick quiz. We're gonna give y'all some scenarios, really brief scenarios, and via polling, you're gonna let us know if the scenario is awareness, primary prevention, secondary prevention, or tertiary prevention. So we'll kind of get some examples going so we can see how this actually shows up in our work.
Great, let's see the first question. As we're tag teaming, doing our radio, I feel like sort of radio commentary. I use my radio voice when I do family Zoom calls.
Sportscasting.
Yeah, when people on a family Zoom call to go, you're using your radio voice. So if you participate in a Take Back the Night March, is that awareness? Is that primary prevention? Is that secondary prevention? Or is that tertiary prevention? Take Back the Night March. Awareness, primary, secondary, and tertiary. What percentage have responded so far, Sarah?
So far we have, let's see, it's climbing quickly. We have 50%.
Let's get to that 87%, and then we'll share. So we're still getting we're not going to let people know what people are voting this time. We'll just let people know. So so have we gotten to that 87 yet?
We are at 79.
We're waiting for your vote now.
Mm-hmm.
We're waiting for your vote now. Okay. Let's go ahead and share where we're at and see what people have said. So overwhelmingly, people talked about it being awareness, though some also recognize that it has a tertiary prevention and some think of secondary prevention. Because bear in mind, there are people that we're trying, a lot of Take Back the Night marches, we're also having survivors speaking out and talking about how to get the healing after the case. And sometimes secondary was trying to be able to outreach there. So I think that was great. Good thinking. Anyone have any comments they want to do, put it in the chat, or you can always unmute your phone and we can hear you comment on this. We're gonna put the question away and get ready to our second one.
Okay. Yeah, we have a number of questions here today, so we're gonna move through them pretty quickly. Okay, launching poll number 2.
Okay, tabling at a high school with a prize wheel for questions about sexual violence. Is that awareness? Is it primary prevention, secondary prevention, or tertiary prevention? So tabling at a school with a prize wheel for questions about sexual violence. I love those prize wheels. That's great. We give away our swag, which we cannot purchase with our RPE funds, but we can be able to have. So what percentage have responded, Sarah?
Coming in hot at 45%, 47%, 50%. We are climbing pretty quickly. I would suggest folks wrap it up. If you're not sure, just go ahead and make a guess and we'll explain it after. 64%.
Great, let's go.
Okay,
We'll share. And once again, we are seeing a lot of people, 57% said awareness, because what it's doing is it's particularly questions about sexual violence. So those are questions that are often about the awareness of what sexual violence is or some facts about them. Now, 43% said primary prevention. And so, and I think that this is a tool that we often use in primary prevention, but I don't know if it's the primary prevention. It's because what it does is the wheel is a way to get people engaged. And so sometimes that's the first piece of your recruiting people to become part of your youth advisory, your youth action group. And so it's a way of being able to be involved there. But so it's a piece, but the activity itself actually isn't the primary prevention, but might be a tool to get to it. I'd love to hear other people's thinking about that. And then we have a few people that said secondary prevention, and a few people had said tertiary prevention. We see it primarily around the awareness. And then Stephanie points out that the discussion is a result, the discussion might be a primary prevention conversation. And so that's right, because you're having people that you actually can be talking, because perhaps the wheel is going to be talking about social norms, and you're going to be working to try to use that to shift social norms. So that can be able to be a strategy there. Great, well, thank you. Let's move to the next question, Sarah.
There we go. Poll number 3, launching poll.
Okay, teaching a multi-unit curriculum at an elementary school. Is it awareness, primary prevention, secondary prevention, or tertiary prevention?
All right, folks are answering quickly this time. We are climbing past 50%.
Okay, so go ahead and vote. We did not say what the curriculum was, so I will say that that is a factor. So I think one answer is going to be, it depends what the curriculum is. So let's go ahead and why don't you share, Sarah? So this was overwhelmingly primary prevention, 92%, with 8% as secondary prevention, and it does sort of provide, so the feature of that's particularly involved in primary prevention is a multi-unit piece, because we know that usually that a single unit session is not going to be adequate to be able to do a primary prevention function, whereas a single unit one could be more useful for example, tertiary, or at least helping awareness. It does sort of depend on the curriculum, of what the curriculum and the audience is. So if you were doing something for an at-risk population, it would be the secondary prevention that the 8% talked about. But if it was working sort of at a general audience to talk about some shifting norms, or looking at gender roles, or in those places, then that would be a primary prevention piece. Great, thank you. We're now going to the next question. Okay, providing educational groups to young people who have bullied or harassed others. Is that awareness, primary prevention, secondary prevention, or tertiary prevention? So these is educational groups to young people who have bullied or harassed others.
Interesting. We have about 58% of the votes in, climbing quick to 67. 70%, 75. All right, let's give folks just about 5 more seconds. I will close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Should be seeing the results on your screen.
Okay, and so we see secondary prevention was 56%. And remember, the definition is going to be those who are at risk. And so it depends on how you define bullied or harassed. So the 37% said tertiary. So on some levels, tertiary of people that have already done some form of harm to another with bullying or harass. It depends on, is it to what level of bullying or harassing. Sometimes bullying or harassing behavior might be precursors to sexual violence. Sometimes they might be the violence itself. So that would be depending on how you looked at that, either the secondary or tertiary. The primary prevention generally is looking at there might be primary prevention activities are being done, but because of the audience being that at-risk one, it's generally thought of as either a secondary or tertiary, depending on how you approach it. Great, thank you. Do we have, how many more do we have left?
We have 2 more, which we can move on, or we can finish our polling game. Quiz, I mean.
Quiz, let's go. We'll do them quickly and vote quickly.
Okay, you should be seeing that on your screen.
Okay, domestic violence shelter and transitional housing. Awareness, primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention.
Okay, people are voting pretty quickly. We have about 50% of the votes in.
Let's share right now. Go ahead, your last chance to get your vote in.
3, 2, 1.
Sarah likes her countdowns. And we see 86% to tertiary prevention, because this is indeed, these are primarily programs that are trying to prevent future victimization or particularly those are around victimization. So it's trying to be able to do that. There is some level of secondary because they are at risk. And so those are, people that are at risk. So I could see where that could go. Let's do the last one. This is part of trying to, efforts to mobilize community members to create local policy change in their community. We, of course, didn't specify what the policy change was, but let's assume it's policy change to prevent sexual violence. Is it awareness, primary, secondary, or tertiary? Efforts to mobilize community members to create local policy change in their community. And Sarah, I bet a lot of people have voted on this one quickly.
Pretty quickly, we have about 70% of the votes in. Let's say, I'll do one more countdown just for consistency's sake. So we will be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
And 85% said it was primary prevention, which is indeed, so once again, it does depend on what the policy was in specific, but generally creating policy changes are an important tool of primary prevention and something that we really be able to do, because it's not just trying to be able to work with someone one-on-one, but be able to change the conditions and where something happens. It could be a secondary prevention effort because it could be focusing on those who are at risk, and it could be tertiary because it could be a policy that affects those after they've done that. And sometimes the policies are serving more of an awareness factor than that, but we are looking at it as a tool of primary prevention. So great, thank you all very much for doing our quiz. I'm gonna hand it over to Jessie now, who's gonna sort of talk about comprehensive programs.
Yeah. So we'll see what kind of new noise my neighborhood can throw at me during this section. So it's important to be able to kind of tease out those primary, secondary, tertiary, and awareness pieces. But I also always enjoyed being able to be a prevention person within a large organization and be able to tell everyone that they're doing prevention at some level, not just the prevention department. So that's how important it is. So in the RPE programs, we are laser focused on primary prevention. So you may have other prevention funding or prevention programs at your organization that are looking at different levels, and it's really great to have a full prevention spectrum of programs at an organization or in a community that can really look at all of those levels to prevent violence in their local community or school. But for the purposes of RPE at both the national level and the state and local level, we are really looking at that primary prevention, preventing first-time perpetration and victimization. And we talked a little before about how we are doing that with comprehensive programs. So comprehensive programs, you can see this definition here, I believe from the Prevention Institute. And so comprehensive strategies are really looking at making change, not just within the individual, but also within all of the, spheres of influence that they live in. So looking at making change for the individual within their relationships, within the communities that they live in, and the society at large that we all live in. So we use a model called the social ecological model, or the ecological model, or the socio-ecological model, or the SIM. You see all these things for it. Can you go to the next slide, Sarah? So the ecological model, you can see we are individuals, right? But our lives don't look like this one little bubble, because we are learning and growing and living and working and playing within relationships, our closest relationships, our friends, our family, our teachers, our maybe our neighbors. And so these relationships affect what we know and how we behave and what we learn and how we interact with others. So they influence our behavior just as in addition to our own behaviors and actions and self-determination. And then our relationships are operating within our communities, which is our schools, our neighborhood, our city or town, and our organizations, our workplaces. Let's go and let's do the last one. And then of course, we're all within society. We have our policies, our laws, our state legislation, our funding, and our media, which all influences, you know, all the other three levels, and vice versa, right? This is kind of a cycle where individuals take that societal piece in and internalize it in either good or bad ways, and reinforce those societal messages, and teach them to other people. So we're really looking at this cycle here, and what we want to do in using the public health approach and using a comprehensive approach is to really look at all these different levels and figure out the strategies in our programs that are going to change, you know, more than one of these levels. So if you think back to the essential elements that we talked about, could somebody put in the chat an essential element that works on a different level than the individual? While you all are thinking of an essential element that works at a community or society level, I'll just say that, you know, in a lot of areas of public health and historically, we've often looked at the individual. So you hear, you know, people, if we want to, you know, be healthy, we have to quit smoking and exercise more and eat better. And they're often individual approaches, but they don't address whether people have access to healthy food, whether people have access to safe places to exercise, whether people have access to role models that model healthy communication and equitable relationships, that whether they live in a society where the media promotes consent and respect for all people at different intersections of gender and ethnicity and race and sexual orientation. So I think some of what we see, what we're doing in RPE, but also what we are seeing all across public health, right, is really looking at how do we make changes in this community level piece. I'm acting like y'all can see me pointing at something because I don't have a screen back here. But where are we able to make changes at the community level? Thanks, Sarah. Because that community level affects the relationships and individuals, right? So when we make a decision to prioritize change at the community level, I don't see anybody in the chat, but that's okay. One essential element that looks at the community level, if we define community level as like a school, is a policy change. So a policy change changes the environment within which the individual is operating, right? So it changes, that policy can change the outcomes for all of the individuals within that community. And so you can see that what we want to do with comprehensive programs is to change not only the individual and their relationships, which I think we're really good at, and those are more clear. We do them through curriculum. I know all of you are great facilitators with great personalities, not either or. And so making those individual changes is really important, but I also have heard and felt the frustration of, gosh, we are doing these presentations and we see the light bulbs going off, or we see a difference in communication, but when they go home to, our young people go home to their families where there is not good communication and a lot of disrespect or violence, or they go to their friends who don't practice, you know, who say racist and sexist jokes or whatever it is, or even, you know, teaching in the classroom when we have the classroom teacher or the coach like popping in with some victim blaming thing. So we're always seeing that effect of those environments. And so it's not hard to, so while it's, you know, something that changing the individual and the relationships are important, if we don't make any changes in that community, some of the ecological models also have an institutional layer, which I really like. But if we don't change the policies, the institutions, social norms that promote violence, then it makes it really hard for individuals to change their behaviors and their relationships because they're not operating in an environment that supports that. So we'll give an example here. One of the strategies that programs might use in California is promoting gender equity. So some of you might recognize this as your program strategy. Other program strategies are bystander intervention and healthy relationships and community mobilization with close to home. But we used promoting gender equity here. And you can see these examples of how the program strategies work together to make a comprehensive prevention program focused on promoting gender equity as a prevention strategy for preventing sexual violence. So you can see on the individual level, you know, doing activities that build an individual's self-esteem, building pro-social development. On the relationship level, we see how we're working to change how people relate with one another, with their closest relationships through mentoring to increase individual capacity, mentoring to promote social connectedness. And then on the community level, we're looking at youth-led community activities and events. If we were looking at policy making, if our community was a school, we might see something about promoting an equitable dress code that was not harsher for women identified students and girls and women of color on campus, which dress codes are sometimes problematic for that. And then at the society level, looking at youth participation in policy-making groups or committees. These could be at the school-wide level or they could be at the city level. Looking at access to parks and safety there. And so this is, you know, where this is just an example of how you could put together a comprehensive program that has related strategies to really do that saturation piece. So when we're thinking about our priority audience, who's the individual, we're looking at this inside bubble. And when we're thinking about planning program strategies, we want to make sure that that individual, say if it's your, you know, Woodlake High School students for Suemi and Edwin, that they're always the center of that. So when you're looking at strategies on the community level, you want to make sure that that's the community that surrounds your Woodlake High School students, right? So you don't want to plan your strategies outside of this bubble. You want your individual to always be the same. So a comprehensive strategy, though I might have strategies at different levels, if I am teaching a, you know, healthy relationships curriculum to high school students at XYZ High School. And then I'm doing how to talk to your teenager about, you know, healthy relationship skills at ABC Middle School. Then I don't have a structured approach to providing a comprehensive approach, because now I'm doing two separate things at two different schools. So you really want to think about how your program provides strategies that move kind of like straight through this ecological model from the individual to all these levels that surround them. I hope that makes sense. And if there are questions, you can put them in the chat. The chat is very quiet now, I think. So this is an example of promoting gender equity, and you could do this with, honestly, this is, sounds nerdy, but we have a worksheet that we normally would have you do that looked at mapping programs across the social ecological model. And that's a way that I start out with a lot of program design in the public health work that I do, is looking at a social ecological model and looking at a logic model, which I'll talk about later. I get to talk about all the like boring things that people are like, another model. But these are really places where we can test out whether we're providing comprehensive programs for the target population or priority audience. All right, so Sarah, social determinants.
Thanks, Jessie. We are going to briefly talk about the social determinants of health, and then we will take our 10-minute break. So thanks for hanging with us here. Can I get like a quick round of the little emoji, Zoom emoji, thumbs up or thumbs down for folks who are familiar with the social determinants of health? This is a concept known to you, or maybe not so much. Okay, excellent. So we're getting a good amount of thumbs up, couple thumbs down. Okay, so the social determinants of health are basically the conditions in which people are born and grow and work and play and socialize. And these conditions are shaped by the distribution of power and resources. We know through the public health lens that social and environmental factors really shape a person's overall health, and experiences of sexual and interpersonal violence are no exception to that. We know, through this and through other ways, that violence isn't something that's just randomly distributed. It's not random who is most impacted by it. And the social determinants of health offer us kind of an insight or a framework into how and why oppression particularly is related to sexual violence. Discrimination and oppression based on identities can greatly impact, obviously, where we live and work and socialize. And it affects our access to things. You can see here we have some examples: social connection and safety, or job security, or quality education, right? Where we live impacts our access to those things. So on the slide image, like I said, we can see some of the social and environmental factors that determine health outcomes for individuals. So again, where we live and many things, right, affect our access to these things, and these things like social connection and safety and availability to food and access to transportation, to be able to get things like job security and a living wage is really impacted by our physical location, and also our personal identities. And folks who have marginalized identities have historically and still, of course, have less access to health equity than folks who have more dominant identities. And so these are the things that contribute to positive health outcomes, the things that we see on the screen. So this kind of offers us an explanation as to why oppressed groups experience violence at higher rates than dominant groups. There's many statistics on that. We know that to be the case. And so again, really with the social determinants of health, we're seeing how access to all of these things, that create protective environments, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes, really impact our ability to lead happy and healthy lives free of violence. And so if the goal is to prevent sexual violence, an important strategy is to create access to positive health determinants for positive health outcomes. Let's see, I have one more example of this. So let me get my pointer out. Okay, so a big part of primary prevention's role is to kind of address all these systems and social norms, and really these big underlying concepts that we know sexual violence is a part of. So institutions, you can see, I'm sure a lot of people have seen an issue tree before. I think it's called a number of things, but we can see kind of down here is that we have these big invisible systems like white supremacy and colonialism, and these are sort of the dominant narratives. And we, in history, obviously historical context and events is a huge part of this, which is one of the reasons why it's important that we look at the history of public health and health research in the US being used in oppressive ways, because really there's no escaping it. All of this informs the ways in which our society functions, the institutions that come out of that. So you can see here all of these kinds of big isms, right? And we internalize these things, and out of these things are born institutions. So to name a few, obviously there's many different types, but to name a few, we have the criminal legal system, we have education, we have healthcare. These are systems that we all either work in or grow up in, or you know, obviously have an impact in some way on our lived experiences. And then we also have institutions like media that really contribute to social norms and the way in which information is distributed and discussed in all of these things. And so again, these, you know, these big dominant invisible systems that are at the bottom, at the roots, are really affecting these institutions here at the tree's trunk. And so out of that, we can see all of these symptoms that come out of these systems at work. So we have things like low wage earners, sexual violence, of course, domestic violence, of course, access to education. We have things like over-incarceration, police brutality, homelessness, substance dependency. There's obviously many examples that we can look at, but we can sort of trace to how these things are happening if we look at, you know, for example, the history of policing, and the institution or the vehicle is the criminal legal system, and the result is police brutality or over-incarceration. You know, we can also see from historical context and gender-based violence in general, we can see how that impacts the healthcare system, which leads to things like forced sterilization and other things like that, right? So anyway, any way that we look at it, we're kind of able to see how these things link and produce these interpersonal systems. So we say all of this just to kind of illustrate that part of RPE and something that's really important about primary prevention and working at the outer layers of the social ecological model is that we're really wanting to challenge these things down here. And the basic concept is that if we're able to address these things down here, then the rest will follow. Then the leaves up here will sort of start to fall away. Another big part of that is, you know, the society part is, I would say that the roots are kind of like the social norms, the things that we want to challenge and change. And then we have the systems or the institutions, which is that society level change, like policy change, things like that, right? So we can kind of see sexism show up in our history, in our education systems. We can see things like sexist dress codes, and then we can see how that up here creates barriers like access to education and sexual violence and discrimination and things like that. So we're really wanting to get to the root causes of violence and address those rather than kind of just jumping straight to the top of the tree here and addressing what we sort of see as symptoms. Co-facilitators, would you like to add anything?
Just, I've got a private chat from someone pointing out that, of course, there are other symptoms that we see that are issues like domestic violence and child abuse that would be there. So obviously there's a lot more things that are part of that, but it's in there.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. Absolutely. I think I had mentioned, you know, only so much will fit on a slide, but these are a couple of examples. There's also tons and tons of more isms that exist down here at the roots. It's endless. We also obviously have more than 4 institutions, and many, many, many other things are symptoms of those. Absolutely, these are just a couple of examples. Okay, any additional comments or questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We are going to move into our 10-minute break now. Just an FYI, when we come back, we're gonna do another quick quiz, looking at some scenarios for the social ecological model. And we'll be having a bit of a group discussion on these issues as well, just so you're aware, so you can kind of mull it over during your break if you'd like to think about it a little bit, because it's a big question. We'll be discussing what potential opportunities exist in primary prevention work to enact systemic change. So I will throw that question in the chat as well, and check some of the comments. So thank you, David. We will come back at 11:45. Okay, so we are going to move into another quick quiz to provide some scenarios, some examples of situations that are individual, relationship, or community / institutional / societal. So for the last one, we're kind of grouping all of those things together to indicate if an activity is community, institutional, or societal level change, or if it's individual and relationship. So I'm going to go ahead and start getting our polling set up. We'll have just a few questions here. So I will launch the poll, and it will pop up on your screen, and please indicate whether you think the scenario is individual, relationship, community, institutional, societal change. So I am launching the poll. You should see that on your screen. The scenario is training teachers on on when and how to intervene when students use sexually harassing language in the classroom. Okay, votes are coming in. We have about 60%. Please answer quickly if you haven't answered already. Okay, we got about 80% of the votes in. Give it about 5 more seconds. Okay, I am going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So we have a fairly mixed bag here. We have 20% think it's individual, 40% think it's relationship, and 57% think it is community, institutional / societal change. It is actually, this activity is working at the relationship section of the social ecological model. David or Jesse, do you want to give us a quick explanation as to why this is a relationship activity?
This is a relationship because it's focusing on providing teachers' relationship with students to be able to make the change. So the operational pieces is that teachers are there going to be able to work with the students. So it's building that relationship of teachers and students to create what we're trying to be able to move forward. Of course, it can contribute to some of these other pieces, but the strategy, some of the community institutional, and they have impacts on individuals, but it's using that relationship to make the change.
And potentially using that teacher reinforcing how relationships and communication works in the classroom.
Thank you, David and Jesse. You both get A+. Okay, we're gonna do another scenario. You should see that up on your screen right now. The scenario is delivering multiple sessions of a comprehensive sexuality curriculum that includes healthy communication skill building. Okay, so we have folks voting. We're at around 30%. Please go ahead and get your answers in. Obviously, we'll explain it at the end, so it's totally fine just to go with your instinct. Is this individual, relationship, or does this affect change in a community, institution, or society? Okay, we have about 80% of folks in. I will close the poll in just a couple seconds. If you haven't voted and would like to participate, please do so now. Okay, I'm sharing the results. You should see that on your screen. This is very mixed bag. This is a hard one. We have 38% of folks think it's individual, 38% of folks think it's relationship, and 28% of folks think it is community / institutional / societal. David, why don't you tell us what level of impact is this on the social ecological model?
I see this as an individual one because it's really focusing on individual skill building. And so it's really, while it's done in the setting that feels like a community setting, and it's done with the setting of potentially the relationships, the main intervention is individual skill building. So that's so that's how we see it as an individual one.
Great, yeah, and I think a helpful way to think about these is thinking about what action folks are going to be walking away with, right? So if me as myself were a participant in this comprehensive sexuality curriculum, I would walk away as an individual with the skill, allegedly, of being able to maintain or use some skills around healthy communication. And again, if this isn't clear or folks have questions, please feel free to ask in the chat.
These are hard, I will say, because there's elements to all of them. So, and remember, you're not doing one thing, so they're connected, but it's helpful to begin to think about these.
We're gonna look at one more now. Okay, so it should be on your screen. Implementing a restorative / transformative justice policy at a school district. Folks are answering pretty quickly. We have about 60% of the votes in. We'll leave this up for just a few more seconds. So if you have not answered yet, please let us know what you think. Okay, we have 80% of the votes in. I'm gonna close the poll and share the results. So 97% of folks think that it is institutional, societal, community level change, and 97% of folks are correct. So implementing a restorative or transformative justice policy at a school district is, again, that policy level change that we're really looking for and affecting change in society. So when you look at these big policies like this, you can kind of think of it, if you were to turn the social ecological model like into a vertical rather than horizontal, you can see the trickle down effect of the way in which society level change, like implementing policies, particularly at a school district, then affects the school climate, which is community, which then affects the way that people are in relationship with one another, which affects things like creating protective environments and affecting the social determinants of health for the individual, by, you know, with RJ and TJ, for example, kind of disrupting things like zero tolerance policies that tend to be overly punitive and more directed towards folks with marginalized identities than those with dominant identities. Co-facilitators, would you like to add? Okay, great. Let's do one more then. Okay, you should see that appearing on your screen now. The scenario is dismantling oppression initiative consisting of debiasing training for all leadership and staff of a company. Is this individual, relationship, or community/institutional/societal? Looks like folks are thinking on this one a little bit more. We only have about 50% in. Just jump to 60. Okay, we'll give it about 5 more seconds if you would like to participate and haven't already. Please do so now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll and share results. So we have 55% of folks think it is community/institutional/societal, 41% for relationship, and 24% for individual. So this actually is affecting impact at the individual level of the social ecological model, because the training is only consisting of debiasing training for leadership and staff as individuals. So again, it's that personal knowledge, what people are walking away with. Now, this would be a community/institutional/societal level change if then, born out of that, they created an internal review board to look at the agency's policies and actually do and implement policy revision. That would make it both. But since we don't have that in this scenario, it's really just at the individual level, because again, thinking what folks are walking away with and that kind of acquisition of individual skills and knowledge.
Yeah, and we were intentionally misleading on this one because creating the title Dismantling Oppression Initiative sounds really big. But if we do that and all we do is a training for people, then that's really an individual piece. If we do more, then we can be able to make some of the bigger pieces. And that's part of the lessons of what the social ecological model is, to think about how we can go include the individual work, but to do more than that to be able to create the change. And so, and I think we've seen this a lot for organizations. They take a big title, but what they do really isn't that big.
I think too, if you take that example that Sarah said about if you then added to this a review of policy and change of policy, and then you make that a comprehensive program, which is what we're talking about in our RPE programs.
Yeah, exactly. And just to kind of add to David's point, really briefly, is this is an example of why oftentimes we see organizations hire a diversity and inclusion consultant, and they come in and they train all of the staff, but then we don't really see that lasting change and impact because it's only affecting people at the individual level. So then those people leave the organization over time. So what the policy revision would do and why it's at the community or societal or institutional levels is because it really creates, in theory, that lasting change and impact that comes from changing policies and things like that, and affecting greater systems level change rather than just at the individual level when people leave the organization, which is something that we see all the time. Now, for example, what could be an institutional change if they then created a policy and said, everybody who's coming into the organization has to go through this same training, for example, and framed it more that way other than just kind of a one-time initiative. So hopefully that's making sense for folks. But yes, it was a trick. It was meant to be a little bit tricky just to really parse out the differences between those things. Oops. Sorry, all the slides went away. Give me one moment.
This way we get to see everyone's names.
Okay, should be popping up on the screen again. I'm not sure why that happened. And we're back. So we're going to have a really quick group discussion about some of these things to think through some examples. I can provide a few examples if folks are slow to start, but it would be really great. Of course, feel free to use the chat, but we would also really love to hear folks unmute themselves and come on. Let's talk about what potential opportunities exist in primary prevention that work to enact systemic change. So we gave some of those examples in the scenarios in the quiz that we just did. But what other opportunities are available in primary prevention work to enact systemic change? So I can give a quick example for those of you who came to our Engaging Youth in RPE web conference when we heard from the Idaho Coalition. They were able to create a youth leadership team in Idaho, and they went to schools and they were able to change some really problematic mascots. So there were some mascots that were based on indigenous folks and tribes that were obviously problematic. And so they were able to get youth leadership teams together. And through primary prevention, they were able to enact that change in the community level on school campuses by changing or replacing the mascot. So that's one example. So we'd really love to hear what other folks can think of. David says in the chat, while this wasn't an RPE funded effort, CASA's campaign in the state of California to invest in prevention programs is focusing on allocating resources. With 5 million funded, 33 new organizations now have funding to do DVSA work prevention in California. Holly says, hello, Holly. Community organizing to lobby for policy change in a city/county. Any other examples that folks can think of? Co-facilitators?
There's also, you know, some, I don't know if it's not really systemic change, but also looking at environments, looking at where and how people gather, and safety are also a part of community level change. So when we look at, you know, mapping across schools, safe and unsafe mapping, and the changes that you might make to the environment, whether that is adding protective people or things like that, that can also be a community level change or systemic change if you're changing the way that the environment works or people work within it.
Jen says that she's working with the school to update the admin about Title IX issues. Maggie says implementing a policy to require training of all school staff on SA/DV issues. I think that's a good example, as long as the training is continuous, to change climate. Maggie says that's the plan. Excellent. Any last examples or thoughts? Jen again says coaching the classified staff on how to interact with students during non-academic times. Anna from CPAF says changing hierarchical structure of systems to that power is more divided / shared and can increase opportunities for community accountability. No, Anna, that I see that you say super vague, but I love that. I think that that's great. We're kind of, I think, getting into restorative justice, transformative justice a little bit with that. So yeah, I mean, that's a great example of kind of moving outside from the policy change. And yeah, like David says, redistribute power, which really kind of starts to challenge some of those things that are at the roots of the tree that we saw in terms of white supremacy and a lot of the other isms. Something else that I can think of that I've seen happen is changing policies at schools that even on college campuses that promote better access to all gender restrooms for trans and gender nonconforming students, right? We kind of see just in society the negative impact of the bathroom debate for trans and gender nonconforming folks, and how that really adds to stigma, which adds to community norms, which adds to very, very high rates of violence against trans and GNC folks. So things like that as well, that kind of seem to exist outside of just the sexual assault and domestic violence issues, but again, really speaks to climate and creating protective environments, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Thanks so much for citing your examples, everyone. We are a little tight on time, so we're gonna go ahead and move on. We're going to briefly talk about risk and protective factors. We're going to kind of do this at lightning speed here, but it's important to mention, especially since we've talked about the social determinants of health, which really fits into all of this, as well as creating protective environments. So we'll just do kind of a little bit of framing on what are risk and protective factors. No doubt this is a term that you've heard before, are likely familiar with, and if you have not heard it yet, you will hear people talking about this. So on this slide, you can see what risk and protective factors do. So I'm gonna try and explain this a little bit. Risk and protective factors are kind of like a framework of things that exist in the world that correlate and not cause. So correlate positively or negatively, meaning that they either do or they don't, with sexual violence only from a research perspective. So risk factors don't mean that the risk of sexual violence is increased, only that research indicates that these things correlate. So for example, smoking is on the risk factors list for sexual violence. That doesn't mean that if someone starts smoking cigarettes, that then they've just like increased their likelihood to experience sexual violence. All it really means is that there is a correlation between those two things, which is likely due to underlying stuff related to the social determinants of health, like job security, for example, right? We know that not having job security is a social determinant of health that relates to sexual violence. And we also know that stress is a factor that causes smoking. And obviously one can feel stressed if they don't have job security. So it's really that they probably share an underlying factor related to the social determinants of health, rather than, you know, saying that smoking cigarettes causes someone to get sexually assaulted. And some risk factors can be changed on an individual level. So like empathy or, you know, skill building, for example. And some risk factors can't be changed, like bad policies and laws. I know we've just been saying that policy change is really important, and it is. We can change policies and laws, but I can't just like go to a training and then will it into existence, right? It's bigger systemic work around creating protective environments. And a lot of people kind of have a reaction when we talk about risk factors, because if we talk about them in a way that's incorrect, like causation rather than correlation, we can sound super victim blaming. And because of this, it's better to focus on creating protective environments. So things that we can do in prevention to eliminate barriers, to create greater access to things that we know are protective. And all that protective means is that we know that they are environments in which sexual violence is less likely to happen. So an environment in which students have access to safe and caring adults is an environment that is less likely to have experiences, that someone is less likely to have experiences of interpersonal violence in than in situations where people are isolated, there's no community connection, there's a lot of like stress and strife and things like that. So again, like rather than putting the emphasis on eliminating risk factors, like telling people don't smoke or don't do drugs or don't drink alcohol, it's better to focus on eliminating barriers to create that access to things that we know protect against sexual violence. So I'm hoping that makes sense. Like I said earlier, when we talked about the public health framework, there's a really long history of health research being used in oppressive ways and advancing at the expense of femmes and women identified folks, as well as particularly people of color. So when we talk about this, it's really important to put the emphasis on systems reform, institution reform, put emphasis on challenging social norms for people with marginalized or not marginalized, with privileged and dominant identities, rather than inadvertently blaming people for their own oppression. So that's kind of risk factors in a nutshell. I will share a link in just a moment if you all are interested in some of the historical stuff with public health. I have a great document that's just a timeline of different ways in which fields, particularly birth control and other areas of health research, have advanced it at the expense of marginalized people. And we'll send that in the follow-up resources as well. It's just something that's good to have and be aware of. I won't go into this too much. We'll also send this out as a resource, but this is a resource from Veto Violence, where you can get online and you can kind of play around with it. It's called Connecting the Dots. It shows us how multiple forms of violence share risk and protective factor. And so you can focus on one set of protective factors and not only be creating environments that protect against sexual violence, but also a lot of other forms of violence, like domestic violence and even things like suicide and bullying and elder abuse and neglect. So you can kind of see here on the slide, this is just an example from Connecting the Dots. You can see at the community level, experiencing community support and connectedness is a shared protective factor that can shield against 6 different types of violence. So this is just a fun tool and a way to see how what creating protective environments is really able to do, and also the interconnectedness of all of these different issues of personal violence, which we can also sort of conceptualize if we think back to the issue tree and some of the foundational issues, and then the leaves on the tree being symptoms of these underlying factors and these root causes of violence. So again, we'll be sending this in the follow-up, and you can jump online and play with the tool. All right, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to David.
And David's going to avoid talking really fast, but be but we want to honor the time and end on time. So part of this is we want to be able to look at some of the framing issues. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and then the next slide. Part of what we do in doing prevention, not next, previous next slide, back one slide. Jump too quickly. So we want to pay attention to our theory of change, or why do we think change is taking place? And it's important when doing prevention work to have that understanding. And then for those of in RPE program, we want to spend that time understanding that, and that informs how you're going to be able to make decisions of what you're doing. Next slide. Part of doing that is that we use different types of evidence to inform what we're doing. But when we're talking about evidence, we're not limiting it to evidence that's based on research studies proving things. We want to pay attention to research studies or programs that have been gone through through a peer-reviewed journal, that best available research evidence. But we also want to pay attention to the evidence of experience that we have of understanding what we're going to be doing, and also what we've done in the past, and to be able to inform what we're doing, and also the context, understanding what's going on in the context, because what you're doing now and during COVID is very different than what would have happened in a different environment. So we have to pay attention to that and make decisions about what we're going to be doing. Next slide. Part of this way we do this is we're going to be using evaluation, and we're not going to go now through a whole lot, but there's sort of two types of evaluation. One is a process evaluation. What did you do? And it's sort of often counting and summarizing the activities you've done. How many classes you held in meetings, the number of shares or likes if you did social media, how many people participated, what are the activities that you accomplished? And those are what we're often familiar doing in our reports, and those process outcomes, and that's helpful to understand and give us information. But we also want to look at the outcomes, and the outcomes is what's changed. So if you're doing something, and then you want to see what's changed. So if we're trying to be able to do a bystander program, what you're trying to do is have people have attitudes that they believe they can do something. Then we'll be looking at those attitudes. We're looking at the beliefs, or looking at the behaviors of what actions they take and what practices they have. We want to be able to measure those changes. They're harder to measure. We have tools to help support you in doing that, and you'll through the empowerment, through the evaluation toolkit, be able to help us do that. But this is what we're trying to do. One of the best tools we do that is our next slide, is that we try to use what we call SMART objectives. Next slide. A SMART objective, and all of you have your objectives, and what you're doing are objectives that are specific, very clear about what they're doing. They're measurable, things that we can actually measure. They're achievable, so something that actually can be done. They're relevant to what we're trying to accomplish, and they're time-bound, therefore spelling that acronym SMART. So I'm going to do a quick thing by just having you say yes or no. Let's go, and I'm going to, my colleagues can help me see what people are saying, that will be helpful. Let's go to the first example. End of a 45-minute presentation. Rape rates will decrease in the community. Is that a SMART objective? Yes or no? I think the issue that's going to come up is that achievable in 45-minute presentation? You can reduce rape rates? No. MK says, if it were, wouldn't that be awesome? But no, it's not. Thank you for doing the text chat. So that's not an achievable piece. So that would not be a SMART objective. Next one. By the end of a 6-session curriculum, students will understand sexual violence prevention. Is that, some of us don't have the thumbs down option, so you can just use your yes, no in the chat. Thank you, Liz, for pointing that out. So end of 6 sessions, students will understand sexual violence prevention. Is that SMART? I want to think about how you measure understanding sexual violence prevention. And so sometimes, and how specific that is. And that's often a very vague one. I have to say, about 10 years ago, a lot of people's objectives look like this, and we've really moved, we've moved since then away from, people moved away from it because it's not very specific. It doesn't say what their change is. We want to be more specific. So let's move to another example. Being quick, by the completion of a 10-session training program, youth leaders will be able to describe 3 methods they will use to assess community readiness. Is this specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound? And now you can see how it is very specific. It is very measurable. It is something you can accomplish. It is relevant to being able to move forward, and it's time-bound, and when it would happen, that's the type of piece that we want to do. Those are easier to then be able to measure and be able to help determine our progress. So that's our quick and dirty primer on SMART objectives. With that, I'm going to hand it to Jessie. Did I do that in 4 minutes? Wow.
That's impressive. Told you had 5. So thank you. That you saw a little screenshot of a worksheet before that gives some tips on how to build objectives and outcomes, and we're going to send those out. So at the very beginning of this, I talked about your field guides, right? They're really important documents, and one of the things that Sarah sent out in the pre-meeting email is the 2 logic models for the RPE program, one for tier 1 programs and one for tier 2. And this is an important document. It really shows a snapshot of what our programs are doing in California. And it's, you know, this 1-page visual that shows what kind of activities are you doing and what's the why. So what will happen because you did you used In Touch with Teens curriculum, or you did all 4 phases of Close to Home. So on that you see short, medium, and long-term outcomes, and you probably will recognize those in things like the pre and post tests. You would see them in your application, and they are connected to your program strategies. So this is an important document to take a look at. It shows where what our programs are doing and what we hope to achieve. This is a document that you can really use also along the way for implementing your program. Are you achieving the activities that you were supposed to achieve? Do you have all the inputs, like your staff and your schools? We don't have some of them right now due to COVID, but hopefully, you know, they'll be back. And do you see, we'll start to see in our pre and post tests whether we're meeting some of those, especially short-term outcomes of teaching people skills, maybe seeing them start to change some of their behaviors. So a logic model is a great way to get a visual on your whole program. So if you haven't looked at the logic model for your tier, I suggest doing that. And then the other really important piece of piece we have is on the next slide, and that's our work plan. Has everybody seen this work plan before? It's also our reporting tool. Oh, that's the logic model. Sorry, I meant to tell you. I skipped this. I'll ask you to go back to that in a second. So if you could go to the work plan. Sorry, Sarah, make it complicated for you. So the other piece we have to this is the work plan, which is really our implementation roadmap. So hopefully you have all seen this because it really lays out the step-by-step of what you're doing. So it really shows how are you going to do the activities that are in the logic model. It breaks down, you know, who's doing what, when are we going to accomplish it by, and then this for RPE programs also gives us a tool for reporting that I will say is much easier than the old tool for reporting. So in my opinion, having used the old tool, so this is really about the steps that get us to being able to complete those activities to make the changes that we want to see. So in thinking about pulling all these kind of pieces together, if you could go back to one of the last slides, to one of the previous slides now. So we just gave a lot of concepts and models and tools that are seemingly separated, right? So we gave definitions, we showed the models. Can you go one more forward to the worksheet? And if we were together, if you've been to trainings, you know that we like to have application activities. We like to have you be able to think about making connections between the things that you learn, making connections between what you learned in this training and what you already know from having done your program for whatever amount of time you have. So this would be a part that we could do that we could do some application activities together and make sure to be able to make those connections. It's a little harder to do in this format, but I want to show you this worksheet, which we'll send out. And if you want to do some practice with thinking about how all of these things go together, you can use the blank sheet of this work paper and the blank of this worksheet and think about your program activities. You know, look at the logic model, find your outcomes on the logic model, look at the activities you're doing, think about what risk and protective factors you're changing, and put together this this worksheet and connect all of those pieces of your program. So we'll send instructions on how to do this, but what you see in this worksheet is really a program that connects modifiable risk and protective factors with the program activities that they're doing with the target audience and the outcomes that they expect to achieve. So you can see that one of the risk and protective factors that they want to address is adherence to traditional harmful gender norms. This is part of what the CDC says is a risk factor for perpetration of sexual violence. In order to modify that risk factor, to decrease it, they want to see that there will be a 40% increase in knowledge of harmful gender roles. And in order to do that, they are doing this boy, girl in a box activity. So you can see how you can connect all these concepts that we've learned, right, down to each of your program activities. And then we have measurement tools on here, but we use the evaluation toolkit. This is an important thing that we have new to the RPE program that we're really lucky to have. So I'd like to encourage you to do that worksheet with your project activities, and we'll send instructions with it. Just for fun, or because it's fun, or to just be able to think about how your individual program works with all of these concepts. I just want to say a quick kind of thing about the RPE evaluation toolkit, and I don't know if Mina could ever unmute herself or wants to pop anything in the chat, but RPE in California was really lucky to get to work with the Centers for Disease Control to be able to create this evaluation toolkit with Mina, and also was tested with some pilot RPE programs to be able to really look at. In California, we have a lot of programs and everybody's kind of doing their own program strategy with their own priority audience based on their local community. And so this really gave us an opportunity to have some uniform tools to not only show the impact of those local programs to their local area, but also to be able to really report to the nation the impact of California's RPE program, the collective impact of our local RPE programs on the state of California. So this is a really great way that we can show that collective impact, and also to be able to show how we're meeting the outcomes that are, listed in the logic model. So David adds that California was only one of 12 states to get these extra funds to work on the evaluation. So, and also UCSD, Center for Gender Equity and Health, which is right down the hill from me currently. So this is a great tool we have, and you've probably already worked with these documents before. And if you ever need assistance with them, reach out to Mina, because she's super helpful in assisting individuals and programs and in troubleshooting or making these work for them. So that is the evaluation toolkit, and Sarah is gonna close us down with some TA information, and I am gonna pop a survey into the chat. Don't leave yet, but when you do, you can fill out that survey on your way out.
Thanks very much, Jessie. So just a quick reminder, I know that we have about 1 minute left, but please visit learn.calcasa.org/hub to get this recording, to get all things related to RPE. We'll upload our resources from today there, of course, and send them out afterwards in a nice, tidy little resource sheet. So please keep an eye out for that. We are here for all of your training and technical assistance needs. Please join us in our quarterly communities of practice for RPE, as well as our statewide collaborative RPE COPs that we have coming up, and our quarterly TA calls and trainings and everything else. So of course, we will keep you posted via the newsletter of everything that we have coming up. And if you ever need more information, you have questions about this, we'll stay on for a couple of minutes after today. If folks want to hang back and ask anything, I know that we kind of ran out of time for questions, but I hope most of you know by this point, you can always email or call Jessie and I. You can have both of our email information right here, although I know that you all have it already. But yeah, please reach out to us with any questions related to this or otherwise. We, work with some of you very closely and are in contact with you all the time regarding, program support and stuff like that. And that is what we're here for. So please, don't be shy. Let us know what you need. And again, Jessie's going to drop that link to the survey in the chat. Please fill out the survey. I feel like I say this every time, but we really do read the surveys. We really do make adjustments based on your feedback. This is the first time that we've done this virtually. So it'd be really, really great to hear your input, what worked, what we could do better next time. This is an annual training. So specifically for this, it's really great for us to have that feedback from you, because otherwise we don't know. And that is it. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to see so many of you. And again, we'll be sending out those resources as follow-up. And then we'll have this recording available at some point as well.